You begin with a quiet assumption that life should make sense. You expect events to follow order, people to respond rationally, and effort to lead to proportional results. When this does not happen, you feel that something has gone wrong, not only in the situation, but almost in the structure of reality itself. Al-Ghazali appears here and asks a simple but unsettling question. Is your trust in logic a discovery about reality, or is it an unexamined habit of mind? He observed that much of human suffering does not come from what happens, but from the prior demand that what happens must be logically coherent for you. You start to see that your commitment to logic is not neutral. It shapes how you interpret every deviation, every contradiction, every surprise. If you expect life to follow logic, what logic explains the origin of your expectations? Al-Ghazali lived in a setting where this expectation was amplified. In his Baghdad, philosophers regarded logic as the highest human faculty. They believed that through argument and demonstration, the structure of reality could be mapped and secured. Theologians relied on systematic reasoning to defend doctrine. Mystics, even when speaking of inner states, tried to translate their insights into ordered discourse. Logic was seen as the vehicle that would carry the mind from confusion to clarity. It was not merely a method, it was treated as a guarantor of truth. Within this climate, to question the authority of logic itself seemed almost unreasonable. Al-Ghazali's inquiry cut through this atmosphere. He did not begin by rejecting logic, but by asking whether any method can be its own final judge. If every discipline relies on logic to justify itself, who or what justifies logic? Al-Ghazali's investigation led him to a crisis. He examined the main sources of human knowledge one by one. The senses, which seem direct, can misrepresent. Reason, which seems clear, can generate incompatible systems. Inherited beliefs, which feel stable, often rest on trust rather than examination. You begin to notice a similar pattern in your own thinking. You rely on logic to resolve uncertainty, yet the reliability of logic itself has never been inspected. When logic is used to test logic, it cannot escape circularity. It must assume what it is trying to prove. For Al-Ghazali, this was not an abstract puzzle. It meant that the instrument you depend on to secure truth cannot fully secure itself. Certainty built solely on reasoning is always provisional. You recognize that the very confidence you place in logical explanation may be the product of habit rather than insight. If doubt weakens logic, what tool can doubt use that is not itself vulnerable? Now you turn to the way this plays out in experience. You expect people to be consistent with their words, systems to reward effort, and careful planning to lead to predictable outcomes. When someone behaves irrationally, or a situation unfolds in a way that does not match your reasoning, irritation or disappointment arises. Al-Ghazali would say, notice where the pain actually begins. The event is one thing, your prior expectation is another. The mind assumes that reality should conform to its models. When reality does not, the gap between expectation and occurrence becomes a source of suffering. You see this in small and large examples. A person you trusted acts in a way that makes no sense to you. A situation you analyzed thoroughly still goes in an unexpected direction. The immediate reaction is not only to register what happened, but to silently insist, this should not be so. It is not simply that life is irregular. It is that you believed irregularity was a violation of how things ought to be. If logic is your standard for reality, what explains the parts of reality that ignore your standard? Al-Ghazali also noticed that logic is not only an instrument, it often becomes part of your identity. You see yourself as a rational person, someone who understands, anticipates, and interprets correctly. Your conclusions are not just views, they are reflections of who you take yourself to be. You can observe this directly. When your reasoning is challenged, You do not simply reconsider the argument. You feel subtly questioned as a person. When life contradicts your analysis, it feels not only confusing but almost offensive. It is as if reality is disregarding you. Al-Ghazali pointed to this entanglement between reasoning and self-image. Logic becomes a kind of psychological protection. If your view of things is correct, then your position in the world feels justified. If your predictions hold, then your sense of competence is affirmed. This attachment turns every deviation from your expectations into a threat. Suffering is intensified because it is no longer about understanding what happened. It becomes about maintaining who you believe you are. You start to see that the distress attached to "this is not logical" may hide the deeper fear. If this is not logical, then I am not in control. If you defend logic to protect yourself, who are you when logic fails? From here, Al-Ghazali moved to a more precise examination of what logic can and cannot do. Logic can analyze relations, derive consequences from premises, and expose inconsistency. But it cannot fully account for the complexity of lived situations, where countless factors intersect in ways no finite reasoning can completely track. You recognize this when you look at events that, in hindsight, seem inevitable but were unpredictable beforehand. Even when you construct careful explanations after the fact, you know they simplify what actually occurred. Reason abstracts, but life is not an abstraction. Al-Ghazali also observed that logic depends on starting points, basic principles, definitions, and rules of inference. These must be granted before reasoning can begin. But these grants are not themselves the product of logic. They are prior decisions or intuitions about how to reason. Logic cannot fully justify why those rules, and not others, should govern thought. When you expect logic to capture reality completely, you are quietly demanding that reality never exceed the structure of your inferences. This is less a fact about the world and more a preference of the mind. If logic cannot explain everything, why do you expect everything to be explainable by logic? As you follow this inquiry, you arrive at a boundary. Explanations become more refined, but they never fully close the gap between thought and what is. At this boundary, Al-Ghazali did not fall into despair. Instead, he turned attention to something that had been present all along: awareness itself. You notice that before you interpret an event, you are aware of it. Before you judge an experience as logical or illogical, you are aware of the experience. Before you form an expectation, you are aware of the tendency to expect. This awareness is not an explanation, it is a condition. It allows every explanation to appear, but is not defined by any explanation. Al-Ghazali realized that awareness is not governed by logical categories. It can register order and disorder, clarity and confusion, without needing to resolve them immediately. In awareness, events are first given, and only later organized into patterns. You begin to see that the insistence on logical coherence is a movement within awareness, not the basis of awareness. When that insistence softens, there is space to encounter what is present without immediately forcing it into a scheme. If awareness exists before explanation, why do you rely on explanation to understand awareness? At this point, Al-Ghazali's central insight becomes clearer. The problem is not logic itself, but the way the mind elevates logic from a method into an expectation imposed on reality. When logic is treated as a tool, it helps. When it is treated as a law that the world must obey, it harms. You begin to experiment inwardly with a different stance. Instead of asking, "Does this match my reasoning?" you begin asking, "Can I see what is happening before trying to fit it into a pattern?" In that shift, the pressure on experience decreases. Situations can be understood gradually, partially, or not yet at all, without producing the same degree of distress. Al-Ghazali would say that this is where a different kind of clarity appears. Understanding is no longer defined by the immediate availability of a logical explanation. It is defined by the absence of distortion between awareness and what it encounters. You are not abandoning reasoning, you are ceasing to demand that reality never exceed it. If clarity appears when expectation falls away, why do expectations return so quickly? One of the deepest consequences of this shift is the loosening of intellectual pride. Pride rests on the belief, I grasp how things are, I stand above confusion. When life resists your frameworks, this pride is shaken, and the reaction is often either denial or resentment. Al-Ghazali saw intellectual pride as a subtle form of self-worship. When the mind believes its models are definitive, it is less interested in seeing truth than in confirming itself. The expectation that life must follow logic is intertwined with the expectation that life must confirm your sense of mastery. As you acknowledge the limits of logic and the priority of awareness, this pride begins to lose ground. You do not know as much as you thought you did. Your interpretations are more provisional than you wanted them to be. And yet, this does not produce emptiness, it produces relief. The burden of having to be right about everything starts to dissolve. You can allow reality to be more complex than your explanations without feeling personally diminished. If pride depends on being correct, what remains when being correct no longer matters. With pride softened, reason can return to its proper role. Al-Ghazali did not advocate abandoning logic. He advocated using it appropriately. Reason is effective at examining claims, planning actions, and recognizing patterns. It is not effective at dictating how all of reality must unfold. You begin to work with logic as an assistant rather than a ruler. You use it to clarify where it can, and you accept its silence where it cannot. You no longer require every event to pass through a complete explanation before it can be accepted as real. This repositioning does not trivialize reason, it refines it. It allows thought to function without pretending to occupy a place it cannot hold. If reason is only a tool, who or what is responsible for guiding its use? As your dependency on explanation relaxes, a different quality of understanding emerges. You do not stop thinking, but thinking is no longer driven by the urgency to control or justify. You observe thoughts, events, and reactions without immediate insistence that they conform to a predetermined pattern. Al-Ghazali's journey suggests that genuine understanding is often quiet. It is not marked by dramatic conclusions but by reduced resistance. You see more because you demand less. You can acknowledge, I do not know, without feeling that something essential is missing. In this quiet, the mind is still capable of analysis, but it is no longer agitated when analysis is incomplete. If understanding no longer depends on logic, what becomes of the one who demanded logic? In the final movement, logic has settled into its appropriate place. It operates when useful and remains silent when it reaches its boundary. The expectation that life must always be logically transparent has dissolved. What remains is awareness that does not argue with what appears. Al-Ghazali's lost explanation points here. Suffering intensifies when you insist that reality conform to your reasoning. Peace arises when reasoning is allowed to be limited and awareness is allowed to be primary. You stop treating the world as a problem your mind must solve and start recognizing it as something your mind participates in without fully enclosing. In this stillness, truth is not a conclusion you possess. It is the stability of awareness that remains when the demand for logical control fades. If truth is seen only when logic becomes still, was logic ever the destination, or only the preparation?